is now 6:30, time to bring the meeting together of the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission. It's our regular meeting today, November 27th, 2018, 6:30 p.m. Roll call this evening, Commissioners Phillip, Waters, and Freeman are absent. Second item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes of October 23rd. Do I have a motion?
I move to approve the minutes of the October 23rd, 2018 regular business meeting of the Planning Commission.
I have a motion. I have a second?
Yes.
That's a second. All in favor?
Aye.
And Debbie's an aye.
Yes.
Motion's passed. Item 3, which we have at each and every meeting, is our public comment period, where the Planning Commission will accept public comment for items not otherwise on the agenda for the first 15 minutes of the Planning Commission meeting. Seeing no one in the audience, I will go immediately to item number 4. And this is a continuation of our public hearing of the 2018 Comprehensive Plan Amendment. And Kat Mack will continue his presentation to us and the public. Kat?
Thank you very much. Good evening, Kat Mack, Senior Planner. Here to present the 2018 Comprehensive Plan Amendments. This is an item that the Planning Commission opened the hearing at the last meeting and continued it. I'm not going to go through my entire presentation to the Commission because I've already done it. Not many changes. We've had the document updated and provided to the Planning Commission. So I am going to just entertain questions if that's okay with the Commission, and we can work through any questions or comments that you have. And then I have a motion slide if you're comfortable with it. We recommend that you forward this document to the City Council with a recommendation for approval. It's kind of going along with the 2018 Comprehensive Plan Amendments and with the budget, so this would be a timely recommendation. So I'd open the floor for any questions and be happy to try and address any issues or comments that you have.
I have So first, I really like this. I like that it pulls the budget, it pulls the function, and it pulls the feasibility all into this. Is that better? Whole. But one of the things that I have wondered about is let me find the page. So that you can read it too. On page 26, it just kind of is an overview of what the comprehensive plan is all about. And it says, the plan details what citizens want the community to look like, where streets and roads should go, how much park and open space should be provided, where growth should occur. And one of the things that just keeps hitting me every time I read this is that there's not, or it doesn't appear to be direction in terms of an aesthetic vision for the community. So a developer can come in and he can put in any kind of house he wants to put in, or it's kind of hit and miss. And maybe that's because I don't understand the zoning codes, or if there's something written in somewhere for that. Can you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. So the Capital Improvements Plan is an implementation document that pulls from various plans and implements projects over a span of 6-year period. Which is basically implementing some of the recommendations of the many plans that we have: water, sewer, streets, etc. Some of the things that I think you're mentioning in terms of aesthetic improvements or a vision for the community is actually residing in the comprehensive plan, which the CIP is a part of, but not is a subset of the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan is like an umbrella document.
Okay.
And actually, I do have a slide actually.
So this is only a portion of that then?
Yes. So this slide may help you. So the comprehensive plan on top, which is the policy document that we have, encompasses many elements. It has land use, transportation, housing, parks, economic development, capital facilities, utilities. Those light-colored ones are elements required by the state through the GMA. And cities can add as many elements as they want, depending on the unique situations that they have. So all these darker elements are what the city of Oak Harbor has added to their own comprehensive plan to make it its own unique plan. And I think what you're talking about is urban design, probably, which kind of is an umbrella document that has a lot of design elements regarding commercial development, residential development. And so all these will have general statements in terms of how things you want to develop. For example, the comprehensive plan will have a vision for Gary Oaks. You know, that's a unique thing to Oak Harbor. So it's contained in the vision statement of the comprehensive plan that Gary Oaks are important to Oak Harbor community. And those get implemented into the zoning code or other codes that the city has, the municipal codes, in order to make that a reality. So we have oak tree protection ordinance as part of that, because oak trees are important, you want to protect them, and therefore you have a connecting document. So we have design guidelines for commercial developments, and they come from the desire for the community to say, so along Highway 20, we want the city to look good, have a scenic view. And so there are requirements in our zoning code to say, if you're located adjacent to the highway, you need to provide this amount of landscaping, you need to have this amount of setbacks, et cetera. So when you come into Oak Harbor, you'll see rows of trees or whatever, based on when the development occurs, new development. So that's the implementation tool. So CIP, Capital Improvements Plan, is one small implementation tool in the larger umbrella.
Okay. So then, for instance, that potential hillside project, that's governed by the urban design plan as well?
In a very umbrella type of way, it's governed by our subdivision ordinance, which is the document that we would pick up in order to review a development. So when a development comes in the door, what are the documents that the city uses to review that, to see if it's in conformance with all our plans and regulations? So one of the things that we do is we look at it. There are several sections in the zoning ordinance, or actually I should say several sections in the municipal code that would apply to it. So subdivision is one of the chapters in our municipal code, and the subdivision has a whole other sections in it. They have general residential design standards. There are street standards. There are different standards. So we've written regulations over the years for all of those. So we have to review. Those are implementation documents. So we review that submittal, that application, against our requirements. Do they have minimum street width? Are they going to build it as per standard? Do they have the minimum setbacks? Do they have minimum lot size? So all of those are contained in our subdivision section. Then there is the zoning section, which controls what happens on individual properties or on private property, basically, in terms of use, in terms of heights, etc. So those are our implementing documents. So those are sections that we review an application against. Now, for commercial development, we have design guidelines. For residential development, design guidelines come in various ways. For example, we have planned residential development, which is an option for an applicant to choose. There are many ways you can do development within Oak Harbor. The applicant gets to choose a particular way to do things. Planned residential development is a popular methodology by which applicants would apply and design. And what that basically says is you can get some additional density, you can get some additional uniqueness to your property and your development if you submit to us, you know, the overall feel of your development ahead. And the development that you're talking about, I think the application came in as a planned residential development. So they are probably seeking some relief in other areas of the code by providing additional let's say an open space, or they're providing some other design factors that compensate for that. So there's many things, many sections of the code that we look at in reviewing that. Now, all of that comes from various sections in the comprehensive plan. You know, it can come from urban design, it can come from land use, it pulls in from various policies. So there's no one element that oversees that. It contributes, all of them contribute a little bit to that.
So then, this whole system, is that considered a master plan? Or is that a different term altogether?
Yeah, the terminologies are thrown, we call it the comprehensive plan for Oak Harbor, which is supposed to be comprehensive, you know, dealing with development and the built environment, and also policy relationships. You have government services, you have community coordination. Those are sections, the policy guidance for staff to deal with NAS would be policies to deal with the county. You know, so the comprehensive plan is a, you know, I don't want to call it a master plan because it doesn't do everything for the city, but it does do certain things in terms of development review, regulations, built environment, and coordination.
Okay, just so that I make sure my head's getting it. This is a capital improvement plan, right? So this has to do with the infrastructure,
Yes.
basically, and how we're going to fund that.
Yes.
This doesn't have to do with anything that would be, this is the way we want Oak Harbor ultimately to look as a city. For instance, you can go into, we just came up from Longview, and it's a very, very defined aesthetic. Or you can go into Arlington, and it's a very defined aesthetic. Same with Winthrop or wherever. Leavenworth. But we don't necessarily have that.
No.
And we don't have that written into our plan.
No.
So is that why then it can seem as if Oak Harbor is kind of a hit and miss? This is the feedback I get. Oak Harbor is the place you drive through to go to quaint towns, or Oak Harbor is the place you drive through so that you can go to some place that you would like to spend your day. And my question is, if this is a comprehensive plan, wouldn't that include that?
Kat, do you mind if I
Go ahead.
field this one? These are good questions, and the community wrestles with that particular question on a fairly regular basis. Most often, we hear that question being asked in a particular geographic area of the community, i.e. the downtown. So,
Okay.
I've been here for a while. I've seen different conversations that say we should have a theme like, and then fill in the blank, whether it's Leavenworth
Or Winthrop?
or whoever, right? We should have a theme. And that has never really gotten widespread acceptance. It might be because of just scale, right? Those communities are much smaller than what Oak Harbor is. And pulling off a theme is fairly challenging to do on a large scale, right? So I think that's a part of the answer to the question. Another part of the answer is that when you travel through Oak Harbor, just like when you travel through just about any other city, except for some of the very brand new ones, you're looking at a community that has developed over time. So the side of town that we're sitting in right now is clearly the older portion of the community. And you can see that by looking at the block pattern, okay? Relatively small blocks, relatively short blocks, but also the streets are not characterized by curb, gutter, and sidewalk, right? They're just sort of asphalt pathways, for lack of a better word. As you move your way north, but still on this side of Midway, you start to see development more characteristic to the 60s and the 70s, right? So now we've got a little bit bigger block pattern. We're starting to see curved linear streets, but not a ton of them yet. Curb, gutter, sidewalk, maybe half the area, maybe not, right? But certainly wider streets, because that at the time was the contemporary thought process. Now you jump over to the other side of the highway, to the west side of the highway, and you're going to see development from the 80s, the 90s, and into the 2000s. And that's when cul-de-sacs were everything, right? There's some of those neighborhoods where you can't get out of the darn thing because it's sort of cul-de-sac after cul-de-sac. Well, the planning profession has come full circle on that, and really, actually probably more than a decade ago, started saying, look, that old block pattern had some value. The shorter blocks, the interconnectivity, the different routes for people to get into and out of their neighborhood, greater opportunity for walking and non-vehicular travel through the community, whereas cul-de-sacs are very confining. And so our subdivision code, and there was going to be a point to this, our subdivision code that CAC referenced earlier went through a massive rewrite around 2010, 2011, 2012, specifically to look at some of these things that are the very fabric of the community, like streets and what's the landscape treatment and how wide should they be or how narrow should they be, pedestrian connections, all of those things. What the city doesn't regulate is we don't regulate the appearance of an individual single-family home. We don't have single-family design review. Most communities don't do that because that's a very, well, one, it's a staff-intensive process, but two, that's a pretty big step for the community to say, we're going to regulate the appearance of single-family homes. CAC said we have design guidelines for commercial and industrial, but we also have design guidelines for multifamily projects. So the only thing that we don't regulate the outward appearance of the structure is the single-family home, but we do have regulations that dictate how that subdivision is going to look. So while some may say that our community is haphazard, I think you could also just as easily say that it's a product of developing over a period of years, which is pretty common for most communities across our nation.
If I may add to that, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, just like you mentioned the other towns, Winthrop, Leavenworth, there was an exercise done 10, 15 years ago, I think, in the downtown to see if that's of something that's of interest here. And so I think a consultant was hired, this is a little before my time, I think, that sat with downtown business owners and property owners, looked at the architectural styles. They didn't have any cohesiveness. They kind of spanned multiple eras. Went through a process of trying to determine if there was interest in trying to find some kind of a theme that would apply, and what kind of a theme would easily apply that would not cost that much to do. And I don't think they came up with any good answer that anybody was happy with. So it's not that city has not spent time or effort in doing that. They have, and found that there's no actual real interest or drive to go towards any kind of a theme approach similar to what towns like Leavenworth or Winthrop has. So that's another reason. It's not that we don't have that. We put in some time, made a determination that that's not something that either property owners or downtown business owners have a real interest in doing, and therefore we don't have, that themed guidelines to do the design.
That's an excellent point, but in addition to that, and then we'll turn it back over to the commission, if we were to point out to you the different ages of different commercial projects in the community, some that are probably from the 60s, that prototypical type where the large parking lot between the street and the building is way back from the street, and really a non-pedestrian feel kind of environment. But commercial projects that have taken place in the last 5 to 10 years, we've flipped that pattern around. The buildings are close to the street. There's a relationship between the storefront, even if it's a false storefront, and the sidewalk. It's a very comfortable place to walk. Parking and other service facilities are behind those buildings. They're not visible when you drive down the highway or down Midway. That's a direct result of our community telling us that they weren't really wild about that old development pattern that we had. And so our design guidelines, first of all, we put them into place in 1998, so they haven't been around all that long. Then we modified them in the mid-2000s to say, look, we can do better. And so some of these more recent projects are a direct result of those guidelines, and they have a much better relationship to the street and a much improved urban design feel for our community. But because they're implemented over time, when a private party decides to build a project, that change doesn't take place overnight. It takes place over literally decades in order for those things to come to fruition.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, I just want to follow up on that. Just so I understand what you're saying with the urban design piece is sort of the umbrella for that, and then underneath that you've got elements of the municipal code. Is there anything in between at the plan and implementation level that touches on design?
The design guidelines are not part of the municipal code. They're a policy document referenced by the municipal code, so
Okay.
so they're part of that. Actually, if we look at these things that are in these green boxes here, that are under the general heading of sub-area plans, each of them has some level of discussion about the physical form of our community. The waterfront redevelopment, branding, and marketing, also known as the Windjammer Plan, had a lot of conversation, and we pulled out of that language which could become goals and policies in the comprehensive plan. So we provided that connection back to the comprehensive plan. The North Whidbey Community Diversification Plan did it in a different way. That was looking at economic development, trying to diversify our economy from reliance on Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. And one of the things that it concluded that we eventually implemented with the county is that we should use a reduced street section when we're in that industrial area. It didn't need the full urban street section, that we could use something less than that as a way to lower the infrastructure costs for businesses wanting to establish there. So there's a different reason why that design was driven in that direction.
Sure.
But the language was still there. The same is true with the North Oak Harbor Enterprise Area Street Plan. That's really kind of a subset of the previous one. It's focused solely on street corridors, and it reinforced that message. And then the SR20 Swantown to Cabot corridor design, we were just talking about that at the staff level just last week, because that's a study we did with DOT back in 2005 or 2006, where we did some broad level design for the highway, but also talked about how will roundabouts be incorporated into our community at those intersections. And that's becoming more of a more relevant sort of near-term topic, because we have some expectation that it will start to hit the state's schedule in around 2027, which seems like a long ways away, but it's really not.
Yeah.
And so there's a joint policy document between us and the state that's so focused almost exclusively on design of the highway corridor. So there are different kinds of documents that we have in our toolkit, if you will, that we can use depending on the circumstance.
Okay, fair enough. We've kind of gone through this document a couple times now, so I just had a couple points that came to mind while I was watching last month's meeting. Something, Debbie, that you said last month, that the more I think about it, makes a lot of sense. This document has a list of projects. There's not really any description of what those projects are, which makes it a little more difficult for the Planning Commission, I think, to really advise the City Council on what action they should take. And I noticed that, or saw that you had mentioned that there are, I think you called them sheets for the projects, which would be probably more detail than this document would bear, but some kind of an abstract. Here's what the project is. Just a paragraph or so. We're going to do some revision to Northeast 7th that's going to widen the street, put in sidewalks, etc. Would be very helpful. And then along with that, so I had notes here: brief description of each project, scope of work, the reason for this project. With something like we were talking about with the shoreline revision between Regatta and Midway, that just a sentence in there. Oh, the shoreline is being undercut there. We need to do this. Is probably sufficient. It would also be really helpful, I think, for the public taking a look at this to see, as these projects have made their way from annual revision to annual revision, what are the changes in the scope of the project? And because, for example, in the 2018 version of this, we had something called, I think it was paveway maintenance. This year's edition says maintenance and street overlays. How's that project evolved? So that there's a little bit of institutional history there. And it'd also be great in this document to see, here are the projects that we have had in it in the past. We're not including them anymore, either because they've been completed or because the reason that we put them in has changed and is no longer applicable, or we're pushing it down the priority list, so it's not going to be within the 6-year time frame that we're talking about. That kind of information which really isn't a decision necessarily in the document, but just for some context for anybody who's looking at this would be very helpful. I'm not going to ask you to do that for this one because time is short, but if you could do that in next year, that'd be great.
Absolutely, good point. Believe it or not, the sheets that I mentioned at the last meeting were not something that has been done in the last 10 years. I mean, that process is actually fairly new. And that involves coordination with all the departments and providing information from various project managers, comes through the finance, and they adjust the budget dollars. And so it goes through a whole bunch of cycle, which we're starting to do actually with this year. So those sheets, though we have them and we use them for references at the staff level, we'll definitely, that's something that we're talking internally. This is good information that the public should have, and we'll probably try and add it as an appendix at the next year's document as this document gets better.
Sure.
So we're improving the document every year, and that is going to be just like the iPhone. We want to release it slowly, right? So we'll have a better document at the next one. But it is available, and we are working with them. It's a whole new process that we are formulating in coordination with planning, with the finance and public works to try and make that process work. So we'll have more of those sheets for the next document. Maybe we can add that as an appendix. But good thoughts. Good.
The thing I'd like to also add, just as a reminder, is that this is a compilation, right? And so over on the left-hand side of the screen here, under the title of functional plans, those plans describe these projects at some level of detail. Now, that may not be great, but if you take the transportation plan that's like this, and the water plan that's like this, and the sewer plan that's like this, and the storm drain plan that's like this, now not all of that is project description. That's going to make your CIP somewhat redundant, but also a rather large-scale document. I think I understand your desire to make it as user-friendly as possible.
Yes.
But also please recognize that the genesis of the projects is found in those functional plans. So the problem is identified. We have problem in this particular storm drainage basin with this thing happening. Then the engineers say, well, the way that we can solve this problem is through this project, and this project. Those then become the projects that find their way into this document. So to some degree that exists already. I guess maybe the question is, where is the middle ground in terms of providing enough information in here without turning it into a 5-volume set that would then sort of defeat the purpose.
Sure.
But we understand what you're saying, and we'll work to see how we can make that happen.
Maybe the right answer is to provide a reference to these other documents about where the project is described. And maybe that would be sufficient.
Could be. And sometimes projects evolve right at the last moment. Like, for instance, the Pioneer Way, that I can tell you there is no project description for that. We know what the problem is, and we threw an estimate at it, but 2 sentences from CAC will tell you all that we know about that project, right?
Fair enough. Okay. Just had a couple more pieces. One, I was gratified in looking at last month's packet that you had added that column that was referring to the goals or the policy statement, where these are expansions, new projects, or, and I don't really know what the R stands for, but that column seems to have disappeared in your document. And I was wondering where that went.
I mentioned it at the last meeting, and we had some internal discussion on that. We didn't know whether that information would be helpful or misleading at this point without giving it a little more thought on it. Initially, I remember the genesis of your comment in terms of, we've been doing Northeast 7th for 7 years. At what point does it go from being just a project to a emergency, like an urgent project? And so when I was looking at the projects and trying to assign those kind of criteria, the stat, and I don't think it's status, but it's kind of I forget what I termed it, but the project doesn't change over time in terms of urgency. Those qualifications will stay the same no matter how long the projects will stay. They don't actually go from when you do the Northeast 7th Avenue project, they're already based on some safety standards. They're already based on some urgent need, so you can make a note of that. But over time, somehow that doesn't either increase or put it onto a different criteria. I don't think it does. So we were kind of talking about it a little bit and going, maybe we're misleading if we put that information right now without more thought given to it in terms of what it means for these projects. And we don't want to mislead anybody. I mean, those are criteria we definitely take into account while selecting projects to go to the CIP. We're not sure how much information they'll serve at this time, not that we don't want to consider it. So we just kind of tabled it for further discussion to look at it.
Okay.
Because that doesn't change. It doesn't go, okay, now on year 3 now, and we should change that from safety to urgent or something like
Sure.
that. We didn't see any of the projects actually changing over time. So that's one of the reasons we thought we'll table it for right now and we'll look at it again.
Okay, well, that's fair, but this policy, this is Goal 2 Policy A, talks about the prioritization of the projects that are included in the comprehensive plan using those categories. And I can see where, because I'm still fairly new, and I don't know how the city council deals with this plan as they get it, but this would effectively, I used to make software, and when we had bugs, we would prioritize what we were going to fix. A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, that kind of thing. And this seems to me like a similar process. We have some priority 1 things that we have to do, cannot be postponed. Everything after that, the city council, I assume, exercises some discretion as to the sequence in which these are going to be done. And in that case, these categories, because the policy says we're going to do these reconstructions first, and then we're going to do new projects, and then we're going to do expansions, that'd be the first pass that you sent over to them, and I can see where they might say, well, we have this item that's a new project, but we think this is more important, needs to be done sooner than this reconstruction, which would normally be a higher priority. Now, I may be misreading this, and that may be not the way they handle it at all. But if that was the case, that would be the utility of that column.
Absolutely. And I totally understand, and I wish it were as logical as that. It would be very easy. It would be. Your reference to the programming and lining up of what needs to be done before other things are done. It doesn't work as straightforward as that when it comes to selecting projects or what gets into the CIP or the budget. There's a lot of moving pieces based on many, many circumstances. Some of it may be, as Steve mentioned, we have all these plans, transportation plan, water plan. They do list what you were talking about as a priority project, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. They identify based on, there's criteria on those plans to say this project is needed ahead of the other project and so on and so forth. But if you actually look at the way we do things, we kind of jump around a little bit because we can't tackle all the priority projects first, because all the priority projects may be cost prohibitive to tackle first. So it's not like, oh, we need Whitby Avenue reconstruction. That's the highest priority. Well, that could be a $17, $20 million project. We don't have the money, so we can't list it here. Even as much as we need it, there's no money to do it. So what can we do with the money that we have? And what's available? How much money can we leverage for grants and things like that? How can we qualify for something? What other projects can we do? We don't have 17 million, but we have 500,000. What can we do? So we pick and choose, and we listen to the city council as, you know, as the year goes on. There are different issues that come up to the city council. We're listening for what can be done based on those conversations, and then how can we use our existing dollars to leverage the most money we can to implement these projects. So that's why it's not as straightforward. I wish we could say priority, let's do this first, but it doesn't usually, it's not a straight line connecting the dots to the most high priority project immediately, because usually we don't have the money to do that.
So I had two thoughts in this area. Actually, when we were talking about it at the staff level is the first one, which is I almost wondered whether the policy might want to be revised, because I wasn't sure that it really was the decision-making tool that it might have been envisioned when it was first put in here. The second thought to share with the commission is actually more of a practical example. So our water system plan, which has a really long list of projects that need to be done, one of our biggest needs is frankly just replacing old water lines throughout the community. I don't recall how the priorities were established, but 2 summers ago, our city crews started, or the city started working on the water line in O'Leary, Northeast O'Leary Street. Okay. Started at the far northern end, and they worked their way down a few blocks. This past summer, they picked up where they left off, and they kept working their way south because we knew that that line in O'Leary really needed to be fixed. When we were working on the piece this summer, one of the connecting water lines, I think from Southeast 8th, began to spring leaks, which is not uncommon. When you remove the leaks someplace else and keep that pressure in, it goes other places, right? So I'm pretty sure that replacing the water line on Southeast 8th was not near the top of that list. But we had a contractor in the area who was ahead of schedule, who could deliver this project for us probably for less than what we had originally thought it was going to be. And so there was a council action to add that to the rest of the project. That's the kind of circumstance that CAC is describing that happens all the time when we're looking at capital projects. We may not actually be able to afford to repair the street until we have to do the water line replacement. And because now we've torn up the street, we have a way to help fund replacing the asphalt. If we were waiting to just do pavement maintenance, a particular street may be way down that list, but if it gets elevated because we have to repair the sewer line or the water line, now all of a sudden we can pave this street.
Sure.
So there's a whole other series of calculus that goes into this kind of process. So, but back to my original comment, I almost wonder next year whether we might be better served to look at this policy and see if we can revise this in a way which is more meaningful to the Planning Commission and to the council.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. I think Zach had a question a little further in that isn't super pertinent to this, but just wanted to ask the question. Zach had asked about why wastewater and stormwater weren't handled by the same processing plant. And you replied that it was largely due to the volume of water, stormwater, that comes through the system, which makes sense. Can you give me just a ballpark ratio of how much stormwater is processed compared to wastewater? Is it 10 times as much or 4 times as much, or? It
would be more than 10 times, and the thing is that we don't actually process it in a plant kind of capacity, right? So, and Zach, actually, I think we talked after the meeting, and it seems like maybe his example was from the Midwest or other portion of the country, where it was very common to have combined storm and sewer outfalls, right? So you put stormwater and sewer all in the same pipe, and you just pushed it out into whatever body of water was available.
Right.
EPA decided that was kind of a bad idea quite some time ago. And so now most communities that have that have to actually spend millions and millions of dollars to separate them. But then the bigger problem is how you treat stormwater, which is it's not cost effective to do it at the end of the pipe in a plant like you do for sewer. You do that treatment on a parcel by parcel basis. So that's why when you hear us talk about stormwater rules, part of it's about the quantity, but the big part of it is about the quality of that water. And so we treat it through either mechanical means or through biological means at the site itself, so that when it gets released into the public system, it's as clean as possible, thereby eliminating the need to take care of it at the end of the pipe.
Okay.
So I can't give you a number, but I can tell you that when we look at the flows that we're processing in the wastewater treatment facility, certainly the old one of the problems that our guys watch out for is infiltration and inflow. So when it rains a lot in the winter, sewer pipes aren't necessarily always exactly airtight, right? And so stormwater gets into those pipes. And so if we have a really, really wet winter, we will see our average daily flows increase because that stormwater is getting into the sewer pipe. And so that would give us some snapshot of what that volume is, but it wouldn't get us anywhere close to the total number.
Sure.
But I would guess way more than 10 times
Okay.
the volume that we treat on a daily or annual basis.
I suspected that was the case,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to ask.
Yeah.
But you actually bring up the second question that came out of that discussion last month, and that is, you know that stormwater is getting into the sewer pipes. How do you know that sewer water isn't getting out of those pipes at other times of the year?
A lot of it happens just through the manholes. And so we know that we've got, you get some seepage around the manholes down into the sewer pipe.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And so it's going to take place more at those places than it is through actual cracks in the pipe.
Okay.
Yeah. No, we don't have sewer sort of going this way, right? But we do know that rainwater goes this way down through the catch basins, through other places where the pipes connect in certain other structures. That's where we get the inflow.
I figured there was a good answer, but
Yeah.
it just goes, oh, that seems like it could be alarming.
Yeah, no.
Okay, I think that's all I've got. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
A few things. So I went back for the last 10 years to go through the CIP on this Northeast 7th, just to understand for myself again. And you go back to 2009, and Northeast 7th was programmed for 2014 completion. And then 2010, it got moved up to 2012 completion, presumably when you guys got the grant. Then it disappeared for a few years when you lost the grant. And then it came back on, with a program completion in 2020, and now we're out to 2024, and I realize that, we only have so much control, but basically we've gone 10 years and we've just slipped the project by 10 years. And it concerns me that if this is really a priority, are we just going to keep slipping it forever? And I realize you don't have control over whether the grants are done or not, but at what point do we get to decide that, okay, we're going to use other funds? And I realize the only other funds really are general funds, right? I mean, you take it out of the city coffers and you don't fund something else. And I realize that $3 or $4 million is a ton of money. Is the transportation benefit district that we're putting in, or that has been put in, gonna give us enough money to spend on something like this?
Absolutely is a funding source that can help us with that. While we initially, of course, talked to the council about it in the capacity of being something that would generate funds to use on local streets, it's not restricted to just local streets. And so it can be a viable funding source for us. But like many things, it's going to boil down to what are the council's choices given the range of priorities and demands on their resources, right? So yes, TBD dollars could be used for that particular project.
So if you decide to spend that money on a project like Northeast 7th, which everybody agrees is a very important project, can you still apply for the grants and get reimbursed from the money that you spend from the TBD?
It depends on the grant source, because many grants will not reimburse you for dollars that you've already spent. And so you have to be very careful that, that the funding source would actually allow that. Now, most of the RTPO grant dollars are actually they're reimbursable, but they're reimbursable for expenses that are incurred after it was approved. So if we have expenses before that, those usually aren't able to be reimbursed through that funding source.
And CAC, at one of the meetings, you mentioned that there's a possibility that some of the other projects, because we're number 3 on that list of priorities apparently, and that moves us out past the forecast for this, that some of those other projects may fall out or get postponed for various reasons, like, yeah, is that a strong potential, you think?
It depends. I mean, it just depends on the jurisdiction and what they're doing. I think Crescent Harbor intersection was one of them, and that's moving forward, so I don't see that dropping off. And I forget some of the other projects that were on the list, but it's doubtful. You know, it also depends on the economy. You know, when we went through the downturn,
Sure.
all cities in Island County were finding it difficult to come up with the funds
The matching fund.
to match funds to do the projects, and so we saw a lot of projects slip. But when the economy's up, everybody wants to do projects, so it gets a little more challenging. So unsure, but we'll be tracking it, and I think just and I'll give you a side note on the Northeast 7th Avenue. Yes, we would like to get that project done. We'd like to leverage funds as opposed to calling it reimbursement. You know, if you have TBD, you use some money, you leverage it, not necessarily to refill the coffers, but to leverage more funds using the funds that you have to do that. But there's also, as I mentioned, we're developing a process with Finance and Public Works for a capital improvements plan to be a little more predictable and implementable. And that requires a lot of information, revenue projections, etc. And so looking at revenue projections for some of the funds, we think past the 6-year period, there is potential for us to leverage additional funds to complete that project. At least, you know, looking into the crystal ball, failing, nothing happens in the next 6 years in terms of any other major demand for resources. So, so that project is looking good, considering the process we're developing, considering that we have a finance department that's doing revenue projections differently than we have done in the past, and you know, trying to match our TIP funds and our CIP funds grant money. So we're trying to streamline the process for a predictable project even past the 6-year period. So it's getting better and better.
And,
Yeah.
and I will just also add, and I know you know this, but it's also, any project is a function of the staff capacity to handle the project. And so if we think about our engineering division, obviously there's the big focus for the majority of their time the last 4 or 5 years has been the clean water facility. And that coupled with the things that they're mandated to do, like development review of people's projects, has left very little time for them to be spending on other capital projects. And so that's why we have a backlog in water line projects, that's why we have some backlog in storm sewer projects, that's why we have a backlog in non-clean water facility sewer projects. And so I think we, at the staff side, really expect that you know, in very short order, their resources will be able to be used in a different fashion because they won't be so much focused on building a clean water facility because it'll be up and running. That will also then hopefully give us a greater opportunity to tackle some of these projects. So time and money are obviously the two things that we need.
Yeah, I just, you know, I get concerned that, you know, if we don't have it in our plan, we can't apply for the grants and all those kind of things that we ran into with the park. And I don't want it to keep shifting off So let me move on and
Yeah.
talk about,
May I ask one question about that? So we have the county building their facility on Oak Harbor Road. And that's going to impact that street, 7th Avenue, right? With a lot of traffic, a lot of different traffic, not just what we see there now, residential apartment, whatever.
it's only 10 beds, I don't know how much traffic is associated with that.
Wouldn't there be emergency vehicles on that street more or whatever? But I'm just wondering, can the county help with that? Like, do we say to the county, like, if a developer comes in and he's got to build streets, he's responsible for building those streets, right? Isn't that kind of the way it works?
In the broadest
In the-
sense, yes.
Okay, so if the county comes in and they want to build a facility and it's going to impact those streets, then can't we ask them to be participants in helping make that street what it needs to be?
There's a nexus connection to how much impact and how much improvements you can ask from a developer to do in terms of infrastructure. So just because somebody's coming in and developing a lot, you can't technically make them do an entire street improvement to serve their lot. There's a direct relationship to the impacts, 10 vehicles or 20 vehicles as opposed to 80 vehicles or 100 trips. You want to make sure that what you're requiring of them to do is directly proportional to the impacts that they're creating. Northeast 7th Avenue, just as a side note, we know that there's underutilized lots along there. There's potential for more development along Northeast 7th Avenue. There's R4 zoning, which is the high density zoning, so there's potential for more density. And that's one of the reasons why we think Northeast 7th Avenue needs to be improved in order to accommodate more development in that area. So more development is going to hopefully happen there because there is the utilities and the services in terms of water, sewer, and we foresee that area being a more intense area, and I think that's one of the reasons why that project has come up to one of the priority projects to get done.
All right, thank you.
So I want to talk about Windjammer Park again. And I got some information offline from the finance director about what all was involved in that 2.160 forecast for Windjammer Park Phase 2 for 2021. My concern about that particular line item is, you know, if you go back and you look at the Windjammer Park integration plan, and you look at what Phase 2 consists of, it's done. I mean, by next summer, everything pretty much in Phase 2 will have been complete, with the exception of some improvements to Beeks and the roundabout there, which they're probably not going to do anyway because it's not a big enough intersection. And if you look at the two line sheets that the finance director included in the proposed budget, neither one of those for the parks includes specifics about what's going in. She sent me an email that has some notes, amphitheater stage, which was not, by the way, in any of the phases in the original Windjammer Park plan. Playground, recreational areas, trails, you know, a lot of standard stuff. Maintenance building was not in the original plan. Lagoon improvements, gateway entrance, et cetera. Nowhere on there is the windmill. And I know from speaking to a lot of folks in the community, the windmills are a very important priority for the next phase of the park. The city council didn't come out and promise it would be done right away, but all the implications have been, and everything I've heard from everybody who's spoken about it, is that the windmill's a high priority, that it's going to get replaced, and it's going to get replaced sooner rather than later. But it's not in here. We talked about it at one of the other meetings, that it's not going to be a line item, that it may be included in that in the Phase 2. But I've got an email here dated yesterday, I guess? No, this morning, 5:52 a.m., that doesn't have the windmill on it.
So let me address that. It's absolutely a priority, Hal. But I think if I could suggest, there's a difference between the phasing that I'm going to type this in pieces. So the original Windjammer Park integration plan identified 6 phases, I think. 5 phases. Phase 1A, Phase 1B, and then 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, so 6.
As I think the commission's well aware, and I know that you know, as we began to work in that, we recognized right away that there was an opportunity to do a little bit more and change what we ended up calling Phase 1 from the original Phase 1A and 1B. And so I would suggest let's not get too concerned about the numbers that we're using to identify the phase, and just think about the phase that we've done and the next phase and the next phase. So Phase 2 in the CIP is not, that number's not matching up per se with the number of Phase 2 in Windjammer Park integration.
So let me interrupt you.
Sure.
So I've talked for years at city council meetings and other meetings about the unclear communication, the failure to really communicate with the public about what's going on. The public, when they see Phase 2, goes to the published plan and looks at Phase 2. They don't send an email to the finance director saying, what is Phase 2? Or actually, I sent the email to the parks director who didn't know, because I don't know if he was in the loop or not, but the answer came back from the finance director. So somewhere there's a communication failure, and so it's not just that I don't know, but nobody in the public knows, and somebody in the city knows, but maybe we need to clean up the communication a little bit and stop calling this Phase 2 if it's not Phase 2 in a published plan. Let's call it Phase B, or...
Well, great point, but I think what the staff's point is that what we've been trying to demonstrate is that we want to proceed forward with all due speed. And that we're given an opportunity to encompass more area than was originally envisioned in a particular phase. We believe that that's consistent with the council's direction on the project. Get it done as quickly as you can.
I agree.
Okay. Should we go back in and spend time to change the map in the already adopted plan, to change the phase lines? Frankly, I don't know whether that time is well spent, or should we spend our staff time trying to move forward on the project? But I understand your point. Nobody has lost sight of the windmill, and part of the communication back to you from the finance director is that the next big piece is actually to do the scoping as to what can be included in these phases.
Right.
And so this was a list, but not necessarily an all-inclusive list. And it certainly isn't a definitive list of what we're going to be able to accomplish, because that Windjammer Park integration plan was adopted in 2016. We'll be in somewhere in 2019, 3 years, 2.5 years later. Prices change, right? Our ability to have funding changes, and we can only build what we can afford. So the scoping portion of this will relook at those priorities, starting with the Windjammer Park integration plan, obviously closely communicating with the council and following their direction as to what they think are the most important things for us to do. And it's that scoping effort that's going to tell us what are the pieces we're going to try to tackle, and then those would be the pieces that we would design and put out to bid. So if your concern is we've lost sight of the windmill, I can tell you absolutely we've not done that. If we can communicate more clearly, that's great, I think, and we need to take that message to heart. Yeah.
So, let me tie this all together. First of all, I think that this is a great document. I like it. I like the way it's laid out. I like the way it reads. And it goes back to some of the discussions earlier in that, this isn't a source document, right? You don't have to show all your homework in here. You don't have to include the source plans in this plan, because it kind of, it's like writing a research paper. You don't include all your research material in the research paper. You reference it or you excerpt it. And that's what this does, and it does it good. And I understand also what you said about, for example, the example with Northeast O'Leary and the water pipe. Sometimes things happen. That's kind of happened with Windjammer Park. But at some point, we also have to have a source document for line spending of over $2 million. And what is that? I'm just asking, as a member of the public and a member of the Planning Commission, to have some kind of a source document for that kind of spending. And does it have to be a redo of the Windjammer Park integration plan? No, I certainly don't think so. I don't know that there's necessarily needs to be a lot of staff time spent on it, other than maybe you know, a few people need to get together. I've been to the Parks Board meetings. It's not something they talk about. So who's making these decisions? And, you know, I'm all for spending the money. I'm all for getting the stuff done. I don't think that anybody's lost sight of the windmill. But how do I tell that? How can I know that from reading any of these documents? I can't.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, the capital improvements plan can potentially evolve to carry the details of what you're saying, or a source document, but I don't think those plans are, not all projects that are in the CIP have well-developed steps for the next 6 years. They don't, I mean, that's why the development of the scope sheets that you're talking about, that you're asking project description, is somewhat of a recent development. As much as we logically would like to think that every document, every project that's in here has everything laid out for 6 years and we can just go ahead and follow. I wish it were the case, but that's not. But we're working towards that, and it'll evolve in time as we can pull this information together. And I think what Steve is saying is, maybe we should, and I totally agree with the terminology, because we use these terminologies, but we intend to mean different things with the same terminology. We want to do the next phase of Windjammer. We don't know what the scope is going to be. And I think what you're asking is, what does the phase 2 have, and does it include all the decisions that have been made so far? Is hard to tell even for us, because internally we don't have all that information and the cost to pull that together, and to make it public. Once the information gets out to the public, then you have to be accountable for that. So do we have that information to do that? Maybe not, not yet.
And some of my issue may be with the fact that, you know, there's water under the bridge already. You know, they decided what the expanded phase 1 was going to be without communicating what is going to be phase 2, 3, or anything else after that. That happened 2 years ago. Moving on. I'm ready to move on. I'm with you. But, you know,
So I can tell you.
we've got to communicate.
Yeah, I can tell you confidently that these 2 sheets that were part of the budget absolutely relied on the Windjammer Park Integration Plan as the source document. And the way that this process typically works is you will involve the people who know the most about that particular thing or project at that time. And it may not actually, in this case, be the parks manager.
Right.
Because he's not directly involved in determining the scope of the construction project, nor is he involved in understanding the cost associated with that. The person that probably knows the most about that is the project manager, who's actually overseeing the construction of the current phase that's underway right now. He's got a better idea of what the per unit costs are. He's got a better idea of how our actual costs are comparing to the project level estimates that were done in 2016 and the variances in those. And so these numbers are derived from the 2016 estimates, sort of passed through a filter of our understanding of the construction market today and what we're paying for these improvements right now. And then honestly, some educated guesses as to what we think would be a reasonable chunk that we could try to tackle. But it's all going to have to pass through another filter, which is the ability to secure the funding.
Sure.
And that may cause the project to contract greatly, hopefully not. And in an ideal world, it would even get a little bit bigger. I think maybe the last thought is that these are not static documents, and the process is obviously not static. It's dynamic throughout the course of the year, and every year that we do this, we're trying to give you a snapshot of, as we understand our world, the best possible way that we can. But a month from now, the dynamics with this, any of these projects, could be different, and staff and the council will have to adjust to those changing dynamics. And then in a year from now, we're going to give you our next best snapshot of where we are for the 6-year look.
Okay, so my last comment, the Transportation Benefit District, does that have to have a separate line in here? Or is that considered to be part of the Special Assessment District, the Road Improvement District, or something like that? Or a Special Purpose District?
I'm working with Dennis a little bit in trying to bring more.
I'm looking at page 32. in the plan.
more details about that, and I think it's better to address that in the next document. We don't have enough information on that yet. I think we just created the district. Still questions on how the funding is going to happen and all of that, and then what projects are going to get accomplished, how is it going to get accomplished, what are the policies that are going to govern that. There's more work to be done on that, and I think it's too early to try and put something in here for that. So
I would expect that there will be a separate category for it, next year's table, because we'll want to track that funding source separate from Fund 101 and Fund 104. So I would expect that you will see another row in the streets tables when we get to this point next year.
Thank you, that's all I have.
Okay. Any other questions, comments at this time? Then I would suggest that we will close the public hearing and perhaps entertain a motion.
and I have a recommended motion on that.
We have a motion that's prepared.
Well, I'd be happy to. So, Mr. Chairman, I move that the capital improvement plan 2019 to 2024 be forwarded to the city council with a recommendation to approve.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Yes.
I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Debbie's an aye, 3. Opposed?
Aye.
Motion passes. Well, then, we got a couple housekeeping items here. There will be no meeting in December. It's been canceled, and our next meeting will be January 22nd, 2019. Having completed our business, I believe the meeting's adjourned.
So we show up next month.